Can't go back to the beginning. Can't control what tomorrow will bring. But I know here in the middle is the place where you promised to be.
Not enough unless you come. Will you meet me here again? 'Cause all I want is all you are. Will you meet me here again?
As I walk now through the valley, let your love rise above everything. Like the sun shaping the shadow, in my weakness your glory appears.
Not enough unless you come. Will you meet me here again? 'Cause all I want is all you are. Will you meet me here again? Not enough unless you come. Will you meet me here again? 'Cause all I want is all you are. Will you meet me here again?
Hey Westside, my name's RJ. For the last couple of months, I got to work alongside the PAYS team that has served within the church for the last year. They had the amazing opportunity to work alongside Westside's community of kids, youth, and young adults. Despite 2021 not shaping up to be a typical year with restrictions and limited in-person contact, we got to see firsthand the work of Jesus in young people's lives. However, this would not have been a reality without the amazing generosity of the people and families within Westside opening up their homes to host the PAYS team throughout the year. Through people believing in the vision of PAYS in Westside and providing a home and support, we're able to spend countless hours with students, whether from the comfort of a basement over Zoom or in person. All this to say, a new team will be landing in August to continue on the work of this year's team. and we are once again asking for an extension of generosity in the form of hosting. We would love to connect with you and explore all the possibilities. If you're interested in hosting a Pay Us Apprentice, no matter for how long, and are able and willing to participate, please get in contact with us. You can email tmccombs@wkc.org. And once again, thank you for your generosity and welcoming arms at Westside. Your coming alongside us this past season has had an eternal impact. We'd appreciate your bottles. Use @SkipTheDepot to start donating your bottles to our El Salvador mission fundraising. You won't even have to leave the house. Download the app and select Westside King's Church upon refund.
I grew up in a small but beautiful community of Jesus followers. And this community, this church, they loved worship, they loved learning the Bible together. So our gatherings were always focused around these things, and often food as well. But we were a product of our time. Christianity, in the early 80s, as I was sort of growing up in this community, Christianity was kind of fractured from our wider societies. Our perception and ways that we thought about ourselves was often disconnected, intentionally so, and compartmentalized from everything else. So being a Christian was something that kept you a little bit away from everyone. Christianity was something to be nervous about in the real world. Like, how will people react if they understand that we're Christians? And how will they understand sort of how we go about doing our lives? The way that we told the story of Jesus, as earnestly as we did it, still had a tendency to disconnect us from our surroundings. But of course, while this disconnection is going on, we still are teaching about Jesus all the time. So I grew up learning about the parables of Jesus, learning about his miracle stories, reading the Gospels and hearing Jesus' teaching. And of course, that creates a tension for me, even as a little child, that what I see in Jesus and what it meant to be a Christian in my world were different things. That Jesus was earthy and connected and reaching out into his world, and my understanding of being a Christian was often disconnected and distant from the society that I lived in. Now, Christianity finds its origins in Jewish discipleship. And if you enter the house of a devout Jewish person, you'll notice something. That on the doorposts of the house, and sometimes on every living area, a small container is fixed to the wooden upright of the doorpost, generally on the right-hand side. This container is called a mezuzah. Mezuzah is the Hebrew word for doorpost. And this mezuzah will be affixed to the doorpost, and in it were you to look, but don't, because that wouldn't be welcomed. But in this mezuzah is a small piece of parchment, upon which is written 22 lines of the Shema. Deuteronomy 6, verses 4 to 9, and then a later chunk of Deuteronomy from chapter 11, verses 13 through 21. Now, perhaps those verses don't immediately spring to mind as we talk about them, but the Shema, it reads like this. It says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might." That might start to sound familiar to you now. It continues, "Keep these words that I am commanding you today in your heart. Recite them to your children. Talk about them when you are at home and when you are away, when you lie down and when you rise. Bind them as a sign on your hand. Fix them as an emblem on your forehead, and write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gate." And then if you jump over to Deuteronomy chapter 11, there's a sequence of conversation about the promises of God to his people. And then it says this, "You shall put these words of mine in your heart and soul. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, fix them as an emblem on your forehead. Teach them to your children, talking about them when you are at home and when you are away, when you lie down and when you rise. Write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates, so that your days and the days of your children may be multiplied in the land that the Lord swore to your ancestors to give them, as long as the heavens are above the earth." So both of these texts get written on a parchment, rolled up and placed into this doorpost container, this mezuzah, and stuck to the doorpost. Like both of these texts speak to the commandment that tells you to write these commandments on your doorpost. So this ritual develops of doing quite literally and exactly that. And that every time, therefore, that you enter into the room or the house, you see the mezuzah and you are drawn back to thinking about the God who sustains you. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is the only God. But think about those phrases. That every time you go in and out of a doorplace, that phrase is the one that will come to mind. The Shema, as it's known. Shema is this Hebrew word for listen or hear. So listen, Israel, the Lord is our God. You could spend a lot of time thinking about that verse because it does quite a lot. There's some heavy lifting happening in that one verse. It locates you in a physical space. Israel, the people of Israel, there is a God. He's your God. So location, connection, relationship, identity, they're all happening in this one verse that comes to mind every time you go into a house or a room with a mezuzah screwed to the doorpost. Like this deep spiritual thought locates you in your moment and then gives you a ritual to remind you that you're connected to it. The spirituality is screwed or fastened to the doorposts, like to the ordinary. Spiritual idea screwed in to the ordinary. It's worth knowing then the ritual of remembering this every time you walk past a mezuzah, the ritual isn't the way of discipleship. It just reminds you of the way. So think about the contrast of this then. I've talked about my beginnings, and then we talk about Jewish discipleship. Here's a question. Is spirituality something that is compartmentalized and distances you from the earth, the dirt, the real of the world? Or is spirituality something screwed to your doorpost, like something that connects you deeply to the world, ritually rooting you in the physical realities of life? In 1967, the sociologist Peter Berger observed that the increasing secularization of the Western world has led to what he described as the loss of the sacred canopy. Essentially, Berger was arguing that the religious belief system that had sustained much of the Western world, Christianity would be that religion, it provided community and meaning, but now was kind of gone. People weren't in churches anymore. They weren't in these communities. So this sacred canopy had been removed. It'd been sort of pulled away. And it's easy to blame secularization for that. We have a habit of doing that sometimes in the church, going, oh, it's the secular world, it's destroying everything. But I sometimes wonder how much our compartmentalizing of faith and spirituality caused that to happen. Like, unlike the Jewish people, Christians increasingly, through the second half of the 20th century, increasingly Christians thought of their faith or their spirituality as something private and distinct from the rest of their lives. Like, did we actually have a sacred canopy? Or were we all just carrying around our own little sort of spiritual umbrellas were just to keep ourselves where we were? Like, this is what I'm trying to say is our relationship with spirituality as Christians has become a distorted echo of what it could be. Spirituality is compartmentalized. It's separate. It's disconnected from the issues of the world. And I think we can see this in this rise of people who step away from the church and choose to describe themselves as spiritual but not religious. Spiritual but not religious. Is this because being religious just doesn't make any difference to the problems of the world, except perhaps to sometimes make them worse? But perhaps there's still a question for us to ask about how we perceive spirituality. Like, what's the story of our society, our culture, our generation when it comes to spirituality? Is spirituality something connected or disconnected? Is it something pervasive and everywhere, or is it something compartmentalized? The philosopher Alistair MacIntyre famously noted that in order to understand our lives, we first have to ask, of which story am I a part? Like, of which story are you a part? How you see and understand spirituality is governed by the story that we think we're in, our world, our context, our worldview. And I think for many of us, our understanding of spirituality is divided. We live in almost sort of with a binary idea around spirituality. What do I mean by that? A binary idea around about spirituality? Essentially, most of us think that there are spiritual things and things which are not spiritual. And then we sort of divide all of our lives up into those two options. It's a 1 or a 0. It's a binary choice. It's either this or it's that. So if I said to you, let me say some things, church, ball game, could you categorize them? And people would invariably go, well, church is spiritual and ball game not spiritual. And if you've heard what people shout from the bleachers, you might agree, right? Or communion and McDonald's. Well, communion is something that we eat at church and it's spiritual, and McDonald's is not spiritual. Prayer versus a regular conversation. We would kind of easily divide them up into spiritual things and non-spiritual things. You see this even in jobs. Pastor versus delivery driver. I encounter this sort of all the time. Like people say to me, well, you're a pastor. You're doing spiritual, like sacred, God's work, right? And then the person will often say that, and then they'll say something like, whereas I'm just, and what they say after doesn't matter because they prefixed it with just. And again, you see this binary division, spiritual jobs, spiritual people versus non-spiritual. But, I mean, do we have to think about spirituality like this? That's the story of our world seems to do that, seems to compartmentalize spirituality. There's life, and then if you've got time, interest, or perhaps if you're a bit weird, you're interested in spiritual things, and that happens over there. And therefore, we kind of accept that that's just the story of it, how it works. And it kind of makes me want to ask the question, why is an ice cream maker's job less spiritual than mine? Think about this for a moment. In the Hebrew Bible, so the Old Testament, as we might call it as Christians, but this is the Bible that Jesus grows up with. In the Hebrew Bible, there is no word for spiritual. Like none. That word doesn't happen in the Hebrew Bible. So think about this then. In the culture that Jesus grows up in, there's no word for spiritual. No one at the time of Jesus was talking about Jesus as a spiritual leader or a spiritual person. So how does that work? If you don't have a word for it, how do you think about it? Or is it perhaps that if you don't have a word the same as ours, you talk about it differently? So what did they have? Well, to understand that, I want to just jump back into a text that Tyson referenced last week in John chapter 1 and verse 14. And this verse in John chapter 1 and verse 14, it just simply says this: the Word became flesh. The Word is Jesus. And so it talks about the arrival of Jesus on the earth. It says the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. The word for made his dwelling here is a Greek word that could be translated pitched his tent. The word literally refers to pitching his tent. What is John saying? Is John trying to tell us that Jesus is a camper, likes the great outdoors? Well, okay, no, you probably know that's not the case. Rather, what John is doing in this text is connecting the story of Jesus into the story of Israel. You see, the language of tent is connected to the language of tabernacle. And tabernacle is a word that appears in the Old Testament to describe the tent that the people of Israel carried around when they were in the desert. And this tent was representative of the presence of God in and amongst the people of Israel. So if you can see the tabernacle, if you can see the tent, then you are reminded that God is with us. A mezuzah on the door reminds us that, Hear, O Israel, this is the Lord our God. The tabernacle reminds us of the presence of God. It signified God is here. God is with us. The tabernacle wasn't about an escape into a spiritual space. It wasn't a place that you went when you wanted to feel spiritual. Remember, there is no word for spiritual. Rather, it was the presence of God in their physical space. It wasn't a place to go to get spiritual and away from everything, but a reminder that this God was present in the dirt of their everyday lives. Like, think about that. Really, the way that they thought about the tabernacle is almost the opposite of how we think about spiritual things. Spiritual things are aloof, distant, hard to access, hard to make sense of. But the tabernacle literally has its tent pegs drilled down into the dirt of the earth. It's connected and rooted. And John, the gospel writer, is saying that Jesus is a physical manifestation of that exact story. That you saw how this tent represented God with us. Well, now Jesus represents God with us. So if you hold that thought in your mind and then you jump to John chapter 15, we then find Jesus saying this. Jesus says to his disciples, "Remain in me, and I also remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me." And Jesus continues, "I am the vine. You are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing." Now, the vine is another image that's important in the Old Testament because it's a biblical image for the people of God. So here Jesus is again expanding the story of the people of Israel as an invitation to all of us to move into a relationship with God. But listen to the metaphors he's using again. He's talking about stuff that we would describe as spiritual stuff. But much like the tent, it's being described in very rooted, connected, concrete ways. Like New Testament spirituality isn't about escape to elsewhere, but about a rootedness here, now, in God. The great Christian thinker St. Augustine would say that anything other than this dehumanizes us. It's this connectedness that we're looking for. The reason we pursue spirituality often feels like an attempt to get away, but actually it should be an attempt to make us more human, more connected. Augustine famously phrased it like this. Talking to God, he said, "You have made us for yourselves, and our heart is restless until it rests in you." So track this with me then. The biblical story isn't, as we've often encountered, a journey from old-fashioned religion, the Old Testament, into spirituality in the New Testament. So we have religion, and now we have spirituality. That's not the story of the Bible. Rather, the united biblical story is a move from distance to presence. The Word became flesh and dwelt amongst us, like in our dirt and earth. So I realize now that the stories of Jesus that I loved as a kid, they were insights into the Jesus brand spirituality. In the brokenness and infection of our frailty, Jesus was present, healing and working and being relevant to his place. Jesus was living something out in the Gospels that wasn't necessarily what I was seeing in my day-to-day life, but was drawn to. Because the Jesus story, and especially when you zoom right into the story of the cross, his story and the cross's story, they resist spiritualizing. They're earthy stories. The theologian James Cone notices that the joy of the cross, the liberating joy of the cross, can't be found by spiritualizing it. You see, because if we spiritualize the cross, it allows us to disconnect from the world and all of the problems. Cone notes it like this. He says, without concrete signs of divine presence in the lives of the poor, The gospel becomes simply an opiate. Rather than liberating the powerless from humiliation and suffering, the gospel becomes a drug that helps them adjust to this world by looking for pie in the sky. But with Jesus, he doesn't just offer us vague ideas that will make us feel warm and fuzzy. Rather, with Jesus, what we get is an incarnational spirituality. A spirituality that works in the regular. A spirituality that works in the mundane of our lives, in where we are and where we live. Like, I think often that what we need is what Tish Harrison Warren calls a liturgy of the ordinary. Like a way of life that is spiritual in its ordinary moments, because it's deeply rooted in the Christ Jesus who is present to us. So here's an idea. How do you work out your spiritual life this way? Well, perhaps instead of looking at spirituality as something that creates space and distance from everything, ask the question, how do I invite the spiritual into every day of my life? And one thing I wonder is if we could kind of recover this practice of mezuzah in our own ways, in our own lives. What are the rituals that you could metaphorically tie on your doorpost? The things that every time they see or are seen by you, every time you encounter them, they draw you back to remembering that the God that we follow became flesh and lived amongst us, that he was present to us. What are the things you could do to keep your spirituality earthed and rooted? How could you live out your spiritual life in a way that isn't just you under your own spiritual umbrella, but rather that your spirituality rooted in Jesus is helping others to become more rooted too? For John's gospel, this begins by being rooted in Jesus, but it just doesn't end there. His angle on spirituality was that it begins in the true vine, but grows from there to shape our minds, our emotions, our spirits, and then our neighbors, and perhaps even the world. So may you find Jesus to be the true vine. In your quest for a healthy spiritual life, may you find that rootedness in the presence of Jesus doesn't disconnect you from your work, your friends, and your community, but rather that the presence of God with us doesn't just make us more spiritual, but rather it makes us more human. And may you and this type of spirituality be fruitful and present in your world. Grace and peace to you.